Okay, part three. My peers as I moved to Southern California. Uh, in Around this time, uh, uh, the this was in around 78, 79. So the porn industry is picking up steam with movies, and disco emerges. And when I finally find the radio station, disco has died. And 80, well, Bloom County has a comic strip of the date of the death of disco. Um, they were the first ones I voted for president and vice president when I was allowed to vote. So that shows you how much I was disenfranchised by our government system by the time I was able to vote. I played Little League Baseball, and because I didn't want to play piano, and one day while going to baseball practice, I arrive and a couple of the boys gather around me and say, "Hey, we found something and we want you to show you. And if we show you, you got to keep it a secret. You can't tell anybody." And all the boys who had seen it were all snickering and laughing. But this is the alt-right mindset that was being taught and instilled in young boys. That you got to keep things silent. That things that you probably shouldn't get yourself involved with must not be made known to others. That you got to cover it up, keep quiet, don't narc, don't snitch, don't rat somebody out. You got to allow people to commit crimes, abuses, and all sorts of other misbehavings. Which is interesting because alt-rights want to control behavior, but yet they are out of control in controlling behavior, which is a behavioral problem. So it's a hypocrisy in that sense. But during this time, I believe it was after Hugh Hefner was able to win the lawsuit to allow magazine publications of Playboy. It was after Hugh, our hustler, Larry Flynt, after he also won his lawsuit to publish his magazines. And if you don't know the difference between them, it's important key legislations that the alt-right are up in arms over, even though the alt-right are secretly in favor of it. So there's a contradiction. In public, they denounce such societal behavior, but in private, they embrace it. And that's the hypocrisy of the alt-right conservative. So, yeah, I was influenced to my first actual, I hope my first actual, if you saw the previous video, sexual behavior education. And I won't give you the details. And then also in baseball, it was in the backyard of the junior high, and there was a track right nearby, and it just so happened that while we were having practice, one day a woman used the junior high track to go jogging around. And she was well endowed, you know, well endowed, uh, such that even though I was a boy and was, quite shocked by the well endowedness, I didn't give the same reaction that our coach did. Our coach's eyes popped way out, and he just went nuts with sort of catcalls, but he was more vocal of, "Wow, oh man, she is just, wow, and hot, incredible, whoa." So that was the male role models that I had in Southern California, which is different than Mr. Childs, my first grade teacher. Unfortunately, when it came time for sex education in 5th grade, we boys were separated from the girls at our grade level, and the girls went into one classroom, the boys all gathered together in another classroom, and we had a video where cartoon depictions of dissected peni were shown on the screen from the projector. And if you don't know what a projector is, you're of the new generation. But yeah, before movies and DVD players, we had films. And so because I had not been properly taught by my parents, in fact, I didn't have my sex ed discussion by my parents until after this. It was probably motivated by the school because parents have to give permission, I would imagine, to teach us sex ed. And so that probably spawned my parents having their separate discussions with us kids. And so I didn't learn anything from my dad, obviously, and so I didn't pay attention to the horrific pictures being shown. It was just horrifying, when they give you driver's ed, they show you the video of crashes and mutilated bodies and mangled up cars. And that's supposed to discipline us using the fear tactic. Well, the unfortunate thing is that the child, teenage mind doesn't process it in a fear concept like it's expected. This was the generation of Faces of Death, the movies. They came out as X-rated, and so they were behind the beaded curtain in video stores, so that only adults could rent them. They were real video footage of actual people dying in all sorts of different ways, whether it's parachute jumps, car accidents, stuff like that. So here I am as a boy getting sex ed, and we're being shown pictures of men only. They didn't talk about the female body to the men. So I had no clue about a woman's body and how a woman functions. I had to learn firsthand from my younger sisters and my mom. And when I become a teenager and my sister starts to enter into puberty, I then learn that, you know, my sister can be a real crab at times. And I didn't understand why, because nobody taught me. It's a taboo subject for alt-rights. You don't talk sexuality. You keep it secret. You keep it within marriage, or unless you're a white man of privilege, you pay for it with a prostitute, or go to a bar and take a woman home or to a hotel to rape her. And that's where we get to high school, with the peers in high school. I should probably set up the scenario more. The porn industry at that time was coming out with movie versions. So they weren't just showing couples having sex, they were showing couples having sex in a movie context. And from what I understand, the movies were involving violent acts, and so oftentimes the sex scenes would be rape scenes, and that was what my peers were talking about. Apparently, they were able to watch these porn movies that were coming out, and they would come to school and talk amongst the boy peers about what they had seen, and would talk about what their adult role models, parent role models, would talk about from watching the videos and in their discussions. And this is where I learned of the thinking of the alt-right conservative boy. It was during this time period in the early 80s where boys were being taught to believe that it's okay to rape a woman because during the act of rape, the woman will enjoy it so much that she will want it, and therefore it's no longer to be considered rape. That was their thinking. And all sorts of other depictions were talked about, and I had no clue about what they were talking about because nobody taught me and I didn't watch the video. My parents one time rented an adult tape. My dad got it on his way home from work, put it in his drawer next to the bed, and so we kids never got to watch it, and they had a TV in their bedroom, so they got to watch it when we kids were supposed to be in bed. And so yeah, again, alt-right conservatives publicly denounce sexual behavior. It's just in private that they expect to be allowed to have the 50 Shades of Grey, and that was understood way back in those days. And the phrase, if she's old enough to breed, if she's old enough to bleed, she's old enough to breed, that also came out during the early 80s among my peers at school. And so those concepts were emerging because of the porn industry. And then you have, as Brett Kavanaugh said, oh, the movies, Meatballs, Caddyshack, Porky's, Revenge of the Nerds, all of those college frat boy movies of sexual deviance and mistreatment towards women were popularized in the theaters, and so when Brett Kavanaugh talks about those were the movies, it should have been understood by everybody from that period of time that the boys in school wanted to emulate what was going on in the movies. So those who got to watch the porn wanted to emulate the porn. Those who were watching the R-rated frat boy, high school, college movies were wanting to emulate those. And in fact, Tony LaBrose and I, in government class in high school, we would joke about Caddyshack. Bill Murray's character, he's the groundskeeper of the golf course, and he has a great scene. You can go to the scene clip on YouTube and watch it. It's where he pretends to be a professional golfer, and his Cinderella story monologue. It is classic. It's the greatest. And Tony and I would just throughout the whole class just copy his Cinderella story, and we'd bust up laughing throughout the whole class. The class was chaos. The teacher he was anti-government, and so he didn't care to really teach us anything, and he merely assigned us to do a one-page paper on a government-themed topic and turn it in the next day as a class assignment. And sometimes he'd have a video playing, but he basically sat at his desk the whole time while the class just talked among each other. And so that was a quick, easy A. But yeah, that was government. But because I was a rebellious child, remember, alt-right conservatives don't like art. So art is not a profitable business, therefore it's an unacceptable business. And if they could, art would be removed from the schools. Don't be surprised if that happens. Utah, for example, took out humanities classes and removed sports from some of the schools, and there were protests about taking art and music and other humanities classes out of their school systems. And so yeah, that's alt-right, that's what they do. And if they could, they would teach creationism in schools over science. So yeah, that's the alt-right mindset. But my peers in my art classes, because that's, when you get to high school, you get to take electives. And I specifically chose art because those were quick, easy A's. And so I had each and every single class of Mr. Swigheimer was his name. He was the art teacher. He taught all the different arts. And so because I didn't want to be in the AP classes because they made you do more homework and it was more intense and rigorous, and I didn't want to deal with that. I was already disillusioned with school by then. And so I stayed in a regular level and took art classes as my elective to just try to coast until I graduated. And that resulted in me having to take some required classes my senior year, which was a bummer, but you know, whatever. Uh, but in art class, you have other guys uh, who also want to coast through school with an easy A, and uh, many of them were alt-right conservatives. And we had tables that we sat at, and the peers at my table would discuss while we work on our art project. And Swigheimer was far away. We sat at a table far away, so he couldn't hear our conversations, and he didn't go around the class really uh, too often. Uh, but by that age, boys learn to keep things quiet when authority figures come by. And so, yeah, that's why when you get near, people go silent because they don't want you to hear what they were talking about. And that's the mindset of the alt-right. Uh, they don't want you to hear what they're talking about. And uh, some of the conversations involved how these peers of mine thought about women. And we were now into puberty, and 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 it was clear of how they thought about women and other people in society. And it was starting to become clear of the hatred that these peers had. And so I didn't associate with them outside of class because of that. These were not the kind of guys that I wanted to hang out with, but I had no choice in the classroom. And so I was forced to listen to all their exploits in the classroom. They would talk about the trains because the porn industry, that's where the trains came from. That's why Kavanaugh is being accused of train behavior at parties, is because boys want to emulate what's being shown on the screen. And during this time, pornography videos were doing videos of trains. And if you don't understand it, good for you. But that's where Kavanaugh got it from. And so for him to claim that he wasn't a part of it, he was just outright lying, because all guys were fantasizing about this. I was in a poorer neighborhood, even though I was in a rich subdivision. I was on the other side of the freeway, and so our subdivision had to go to the poor high school, Norco High, rather than Corona, which was a mix of poor and rich over in Corona. And so Norco also was a poor and rich mix, but the rich were less than the poor. And so poor boys don't have their parents running around the world on vacations and business trips where they take their wives, leaving their kids to handle themselves at home. Those are for the rich families. And my parents were well-to-do, but they were not rich because they chose to have kids rather than just the token one or two kids that are manageable in an alt-right family. So my parents had to fork out more money for having kids than the typical rich family would. So yeah, if my parents chose not to have kids, just me and my brother, they would have had a lot more money to spend on trips around the world as the elite rich would have. And Kavanaugh comes from that elite rich. That's why there were parties at his peers' homes, because their parents were gallivanting around the world on vacations and business trips. And there was one party that we finally were able to have at one of my peers, basketball peers' parents' house, his home. And yeah, when it was found out that his parents were going on vacation or on a business trip and they were going to be gone for the weekend, the boy didn't hesitate to notify the rest of his peers to organize a party at his house, because parents are away, the boys will play, and they want parties. And they even managed to sneak in beer uh, by fooling the convenience store clerks that they were old enough to buy beer, or they got an 18-year-old who was able to buy beer on their behalf, because I think it was 18 that was the drinking age in California at the time. But yeah, that's what they did. That's when you're given your freedom, you have the parties and emulate the bad behavior in the movies and in porn. And I was specifically told how they thought they could get away with their bad behavior. You know, you do it when the parents are gone, and then you just clean up after the party so that the parents never know that there was a party going on. And their mindset was such that they wanted to bring certain people to the party who were not well liked, specifically to fool them into thinking they were part of the group now, just so that they can get them drunk and see how they would behave drunk. Because back in those days, as boys, it's hilarious when people are drunk. And so that was one of the tactics they liked to do. The other tactic was to talk about getting women drunk. And that way, when she ends up pregnant the next morning, you can just blame it on the alcohol, and maybe she doesn't remember who it was that she slept with, and so she'll never know who the father is, and you don't have to worry about having to commit to a child support situation or marrying her at a shotgun wedding. And so yeah, they tried to get me to do that. And after having heard them talk about another guy that they wanted to get drunk and see how he would behave, when they then came to me and said, hey, this is what you do, man. When you're alone on the couch, you know, get her a beer, get her drunk, and then you, of course, will have some beer, and you can then make your moves on her. And if she's still not drunk enough and rejects you, you can blame it on the beer. And otherwise, you can take her into one of the rooms, which were being occupied later that evening as the party went on, and use the bed. And of course, back in those days, guys didn't want to use condoms. And that was their thinking. They didn't want to use the condoms. And so the excuses of, oh, I want to be able to feel you, baby. I love you. I want to feel. All that comes out. But that's the alt-right thinking, is how to get away with criminal sexual behavior. And it wasn't just sexual behavior of the alt-right teenage boy. During the 80s, it was also a homophobic period of time where certain music bands were being exposed as being gay bands. And so the teenage boys were talking about their hatred of homosexual behavior. And we had a peer in high school who admitted he was homosexual when pressed upon, but he still kept to himself. He didn't really advertise that he was gay. So he would get picked on. But here's the alt-right thinking about homosexuals. I was told by peers who were expressing their hatred that homosexuals should be rounded up, airdropped from a plane onto a deserted island out in the Pacific, and then that island should be used as a nuclear test site. That's the alt-right conservative mindset about homosexuals and what to do with them. So if you think Nazi gas chambers were horrific, you don't know nothing about what's still going on in the minds of alt-right conservatives today. We may have defeated the Nazis in Nazi Germany, but the alt-right mindset of the Nazis still exists in the United States. And I witnessed it firsthand among my peers as a little boy growing up. I had to listen in art class to a senior talk about how he sexually mistreated freshmen and sophomores, that they were easy targets for him because he was a senior. And he talked about exactly what Trump did on the famous bus, Access Hollywood bus, that he got recorded for. Because he said the exact same thing when I was in high school that Trump did on the bus. When you're a senior, sophomores, you can grab them by the exact same thing. They haven't changed their mindset. After all these decades, they still think this way. So Trump isn't new and horrible as an isolated incident. Trump is just expressing what is a common belief system in the alt-right conservatives that existed when I was a kid. And that was my peer experience of the alt-right. And we had one day in our social studies class where the teacher tried to teach us logical argument and discern between fallacious arguments. And of course, you have to use politics as a background in that discussion. And so he tried to teach how Reagan government was causing problems in our nation. And my alt-right conservative peer debated him in the class, dominating the discussion. Just like Rush Limbaugh, who was on the radio back then, did on his shows. You know, today we have Hannity and Fox News, but back then we had Rush Limbaugh, who taught the alt-right how to believe, how to think. He was the one preaching the hatred to the alt-right agenda. And that's where all the boys got their ideas from. And then, of course, WWE was during that time period as well. And yeah, all of the atrocities of the alt-right were ingrained in our society all the way back then. It had permeated society, and we just didn't know about it because they kept it secret, and they enforced it as secret by ensuring that people didn't narc on them, didn't snitch, because then the adults back then would suppress their thoughts and not allow them to think that way. But they still think that way. You can't change a person's thinking. You can punish them all you want, but they don't change their thinking. And when you punish people for their thinking, they get reinforced that they were right in the first place and that they are being persecuted. Even on the liberal side, if conservatives punish liberals for thinking liberal thoughts, liberals don't just say, oh, you're right, I need to become conservative in my thinking. Instead, liberals get more liberal in their thinking because of the oppression from conservatives. That's how it works. So putting people in jail for behavioral problems and thinking problems doesn't do anything. It just makes the problem worse. And so I'm over time for this one, but I had to get all of my my high school childhood years out of the way so that I can move on to the LDS Church next.